And hello again from Fox News in Washington. Donald Trump was busy putting out fires this week, trying to get House Speaker Paul Ryan on board his campaign. But this weekend, Trump faces new problems. A newspaper investigation into his treatment of women over the years. And a strange story that he often posed as a publicist to brag about himself. Joining me now, Republican National Committee Chair Reince Priebus, live from RNC headquarters. Chairman, I want to start with that article in the New York Times today. It's called Crossing the Line, Trump's Private Conduct with Women. They did more than 50 interviews over 6 weeks, and they say they found repeated instances of Trump insulting women and making unwanted advances, even in the workplace. Chairman Priebus, does that bother you?
Well, you know, a lot of things bother me, Chris, and obviously I'm the wrong person to be asking that particular question, but look, we've been
wait a minute. Why are you the wrong person? I mean, you're the chairman of the party. This is your nominee, and they're saying that he has mistreated women over the years.
What I would say is, you know, we've been working on this primary for over a year, Chris, and I've got to tell you, I think that all these stories that come out, and they come out every couple weeks, people just don't care. I think people look at Donald Trump and say, and Hillary Clinton, and say, who's going to bring an earthquake to Washington, D.C.? I think the bigger issue when we make these judgments about people are, you know, whether or not individuals are throwing stones in glass houses. And when people are hypocrites, obviously that's when these stories have an impact. But I don't think Donald Trump and his personal life is something that people are looking at and saying, well, I'm surprised that he's had girlfriends in the past. That's not what people look at Donald Trump for. And so I think the traditional playbook and analysis really don't apply.
But forgive me, it's not whether or not he had girlfriends. The question is whether or not he mistreated women, whether he made unwanted advances, whether he humiliated women in the workplace. I don't understand why you say that people don't care about that, and are you going to look into the allegations?
Well, look, I'm not saying people don't care about it. I'm just saying I think the reason he's where he's at is that he represents something much different than the traditional analysis of individual candidates. And yes, everything bothers me, Chris. But I don't know the truth of these things. I don't know, other than reading an article, whether or not these things are true. I think it's something that Donald Trump is going to have to answer questions in regard to. All I'm saying, though, is that after a year of different stories, you know, nothing applies. And so that's all I'm saying. And that I think the bigger question is, between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who represents somebody that's going to bring a more efficient, accountable, effective government here in Washington? A career politician or a total outsider with potentially some flaws, and a businessman that can get something done? That's what this is about. Now, whether it's going to be a race to the bottom or not, I'm not sure.
I do want to ask you, though, because the question of character, particularly in a president, is important. And Donald Trump, Lord knows, has been bringing up Hillary Clinton's character and Bill Clinton's character. There's also a story in the Washington Post that Trump used to call reporters claiming to be a publicist named John Miller, but really it was Trump, to brag about himself and his exploits with women. Here's a clip from one of those phone calls back in the 90s, and then Trump this week denying that it's him.
He's somebody that has a lot of options, and frankly, he gets called by everybody. He's living with Marla, and he's got 3 other girlfriends.
It was not me on the phone, and it doesn't sound like me on the phone, I will tell you that, and it was not me on the phone.
But back in the 90s, Trump admitted to that reporter later that it was him, and he testified in a court case that he sometimes used the assumed name John Miller. I guess the real question is, what do you say, Chairman, to women voters out there who are going to hear these stories about Trump bragging about his exploits, about him allegedly mistreating women? What do you say to them if they have concerns and question whether or not they'd really want this man to be president?
I think that each individual person out there should evaluate our potential nominee based on the answers that he gives to these questions, but also look at what's at stake in this country and whether or not Hillary Clinton represents someone that's going to bring the needed change that we have here in Washington. And look, a story of 30 years ago and whether Donald Trump impersonated someone or not that he denies is really not the most important thing for us to talk about when you look at Hillary Clinton and you look at the fact that just this past week the Clinton Foundation is being charged with exchanging access for cash. You've got 4 dead Americans in Benghazi, and instead we're talking about a planted story by somebody in the Washington Post from 30 years ago that really has no consequence at all to the issues facing this country. I think that's what every American is going to be faced with, is that fundamental question as to which person is going to bring a seismic change to Washington, D.C. And the old playbook, Chris, the same old analysis isn't applying in this election. And so I get that this stuff is interesting, but we've been through this and it has not moved the dial one notch.
Let me ask you about another question, which is Trump's continued refusal to release his tax returns. He says that he's not going to release them until an IRS audit is complete. He was asked this week what his effective tax rate is. He said it's none of your business. Look, you talk about this, but every Republican nominee since Richard Nixon, who at one time was under an audit, has released their tax returns. I mean, is this the kind of transparency that we can expect?
I'm not sure. I mean, Romney released his taxes very late, and he paid a dear price for it by playing games footsie with releasing it or not. And, it turned out to be something that was not good for us in 2012. But, I'm not sure whether Americans actually care or not, whether Donald Trump releases his taxes or not. And that's a question for Donald Trump, and he's either going to benefit or suffer from the decisions that he makes on that particular issue. But again, not to be repetitive, but whether this issue is going to apply to Donald Trump in a negative way or not, I'm not sure of, but so far, most things have not, because he represents something far different than these particular individual issues. It's a bigger question, which is who is going to blow up the system? Who is going to get the change that people want done? People are angry, and they're angry, and they want something done, and they view Donald Trump as the person to do it. That's what this election's coming down to.
But don't you think, I mean, just looking at this in a philosophical matter, obviously we know a lot, and maybe people don't like it about Hillary Clinton, but at least she's been vetted. Don't you think that it's legitimate for people to look into who Donald Trump is? For instance, the Washington Post, Bob Woodward, the famous reporter there, now says that there are 20 reporters at the Post looking into Trump. We don't know much about his private life. We don't know much about his professional life. Isn't that legitimate?
No, I don't. Listen, I'm not saying it's not legitimate, Chris. It's all legitimate. I'm just saying I don't know if it's even going to. I don't think it's going to affect people's view of who and what Donald Trump represents to them, given this election and the electorate. So, granted, I don't have a problem with reporters looking into things, but I also think they should be looking at Hillary Clinton and her past and her treatment of women and her treatment of women in the workplace and the way she acted on this email scandal and whether she's going to be indicted and the Clinton Foundation and Benghazi. I mean, look, there's a reason why Hillary Clinton's stuck in the mud and still beating back a socialist in her own party. So granted, I'm not saying there aren't going to be issues to be discussed. I'm just saying I think the issues that apply to Donald Trump are so big and so fundamental and universal across the board that these individual things that we're going to be talking about and reading about, I just don't think they're going to. I don't think they're going to hit him. I think they're going to bounce off of him.
Finally, Trump met this week with a lot of Republican leaders, including Paul Ryan. You were the third man in the room for those meetings. Yesterday, Ryan spoke to the Wisconsin State Republican Convention and said he's not yet ready to endorse Trump. Here he is.
We think it's important that we have real party unity, not pretend party unity, but real party unity, so that we go into the fall election at full strength.
Chairman Priebus, how confident are you that Speaker Ryan in the end will endorse Donald Trump? And, you know, he keeps talking about a process. How long is this process going to take?
Well, listen, I don't speak for Paul Ryan, but what I can tell you is that I think both of these guys came into the meeting expecting a good meeting, but I think they left and it was a great meeting. I think they made a lot of progress, and I would be, I'd be surprised if we didn't get there, not too much longer in the distant future. So I think it was a good meeting, and I take Paul at his word. He wouldn't go do a press conference and say the things that he said just to say them. He believes it, and he's sincere, but he wants to make sure it's real. He doesn't want to just put on a show. He wants to understand and make sure there's a real understanding of each other before he makes that endorsement.
I got one last question for you, and we got about a minute left. There's a report today that a number of leading conservatives are talking about trying to mount an independent conservative campaign for president. How seriously do you take that?
Well, I always take things like that seriously, but I also know that the law makes it very difficult. I mean, they could try to hijack another party and get on the ballot. But look, it's a suicide mission for our country, because what it means is that you're throwing down not just 8 years of the White House, but potentially 100 years on the Supreme Court, and wrecking this country for many generations. And so I think that's the legacy these folks will leave behind. I think it's very dangerous, and there's other ways to get assurances on the things that they're worried about, which is what Paul Ryan is doing, and making sure that some things are understood before moving forward with some particular people. And I think Paul Ryan's approach is much better.
If I may, real quickly, what would you say to people like Mitt Romney and Bill Kristol who were involved in this effort?
I think they should consider the ramifications of what's going to happen on the Supreme Court, get assurances from Donald Trump that they're satisfied with, that would show that he's committed to those conservative justices, make sure the justices that are being considered are people that the Federalist Society and Heritage and other groups think are great, and I think that's the better way to go as opposed to this third-party route.
Chairman Priebus, thank you. Thanks for your time today. Always a pleasure to talk to you, sir.
You bet, Chris. Thank you.